he talks about how he was over, I don't know how many Satanists, call them churches. He was like the bishop.
You gotta be kidding me.
What was in her heart? You don't know what sin she'd committed. You don't know how much unbelief was there. You don't know whether she hated her husband.
I don't think so.
Why would anybody spend so much time ranting and raving about something that they don't believe in?
Really?
Welcome to Skeptics Brew Pub with Brother Brewer. Welcome to episode 35 of Skeptics Brew Pub. I'm Brother Brewer, and today we're taking a break from politics and religion-type discussions, and I'm talking with Adrian Ward from the One Last Story podcast. Now, his show is a wonderful mix of stories from the early days of Gothic horror and weird fiction, and Chancellor Ward mixes small bits of his own story as the show progresses. He's the 51st Vice-Chancellor of the University of Aldergate and describes himself as a lover of bizarre and macabre fiction. Welcome to the pub, sir.
And hello, Brother Brewer. It's a pleasure to speak with you.
Now, I wanted to ask. Of course, I'm very curious about your show because I've been a fan since day one. Now, what was the inspiration for One Last Story? How did you get started with it?
I had to do something. Essentially, not to belabor the point, and there's nothing less interesting than other people's health, but I essentially am in the long and protracted process of recovering from a fairly complete meltdown, both personally and professionally. And, well, that left me entirely unable to work or do anything else. But as I've recovered, slowly but hopefully quite surely, I saw an opportunity to put my love of literature into some kind of tangible form. I can't do much, but I can read and I can speak. And so I wanted to share with the world some of my favorite stories. And, of course, in the process, I've had shared with me a lot more than I ever had really suspected. And it's been a wonderful experience, I must say, sort of dragging myself back from my own personal brink with the help of all the cosmic horrors I can find.
Well, yeah, some of the things that I love about your show is not just the stories, which somehow you seem to find these wonderful classic gems of stories, but also you kind of throw in a little bit of your own personal story to it. And on the one hand, it starts to sound a lot like its own little classic Gothic story on its own. And I think that part of the mystery of the show is trying to see where you're going to go next, as well as where the stories are going to go. I think
it's so difficult to tell the difference between that which is concealed and that which is just not sufficiently interesting to talk about. So I would that I were much of a mystery myself. I like to think that I've led a fairly interesting life, and the realization that I was at one point very much looking down the barrel of not getting to live it anymore. That was certainly an interesting experience, and who knows what the future may bring. But as for now, essentially, I've turned to the books that I have, all of which are borrowed from my hosts. I'm very much, I rely upon the kindness of strangers at this point in my career. And books are incredibly kind. They ask nothing of you, which has been about what I've been able to give for most of the last few years. And so, as a result, really where the One Last Story podcast came from was, well, I mean, the title, One Last Story, that was about what I thought I had in me. I had been listening to a lot of podcasts, and I was interested in the idea, particularly given the constraints on my own activities. And I rather fancied the idea, but the reality of having to actually organize and do the thing was incredibly exhausting at a time when I really didn't think I had it in me to keep going. And so that title, over the One Last Story podcast, I never really thought it was going to get beyond that first story. And, well, I don't want to say here we are, because we're pushing the 20th episode at this point, I suppose, which is, it's not bad. It doesn't doesn't compare certainly to the Skeptic's Brew Pub, but who knows? Give me a few more months, and we'll get there.
Oh, you're too kind on that. I really have honestly enjoyed, as I was telling you before the show started, I heard your first episode, which unfortunately is no longer available, with where you read The Outsider, and you had me hooked because The Outsider is probably one of my 2 favorite Lovecraft stories. And I've been following ever since, and you've been introducing me actually to a lot of writers that I had not heard of before. And so I'm getting to meet all kinds of new writers as it goes.
Well, I'm terribly gratified to hear that. I have been introduced myself by the recommendations of others. As I say, I've been largely at the mercy of what was at my fingertips, but, well, one thing leads to another, and the beauty of the internet is that everybody has a limitless library, particularly for some of these older stories, which I do think get left behind unfairly. And so, between my own searches and recommendations and other podcasts, etc., there is a wonderful world out there of strangeness and horror, and what more could one want?
That's true. And I was going to ask you also, I think we had started running down this rabbit hole while we were talking before the show started about what keeps these stories so fresh in our psyche, because as our society continues, we still come back to those old themes. I mean, there are movies that are based on, for instance, John Carpenter's The Thing comes right out of In the Mountains of Madness. I mean, these themes, they just keep coming up. What do you think it is that keeps them so alive for us?
Were I but an academic, my one stint in that direction turned out poorly for all involved. However, I claim no analytical capabilities, but I would have to say that, well, it's necessarily it's an evergreen topic because, well, it is fundamentally the unknown, and there's an element of trespass in it against the bounds of the real, or the bounds of the understood. And that's inherently something that can't grow old, because if it's done well, of course, if it's done poorly, it gets forgotten immediately because it's no good. But if it's done well, it sits inherently outside of time. And I think that is the reason why we do see Lovecraft, for example. Certainly, I think that HPL does get more credit than he necessarily deserves as sort of the godfather of this genre, because he himself took inspiration from so many different places. But if we were to look at one single titan of the genre, I think it would have to be him. And I think he's representative of what is so fantastic about the fantastic, about weird fiction. So, particularly because so much of his writing is honestly quite mediocre. And the fact that his stories have this life above and apart from the purple prose and the casual racism, it really is quite remarkable.
I think it is, and some of the ideas, like the ones expressed in The Outsider, you get, at least for me, I start to get an idea of someone that has always felt out, not just outside of time, but maybe has felt like the alien or the outsider. And so, even though the twist to the story, which I'm not going to give away, no spoilers, you still sympathize with the character, you still empathize with him, and you get this idea maybe that, you're not alone in the universe, even if you feel like it, because there's someone else out there maybe that feels that same way, even when it's taken to that Lovecraftian extreme.
Indeed, of course, that's a lovely sentiment. We are not alone, of course, particularly in the mythos, in the Lovecraftian universe. Certainly we're not alone, and that's hardly a source for comfort. But be that as it may, I honestly sympathize entirely. The reason I chose The Outsider for the first story that I read, first of all, because it's quite short, which is a good reason for anybody who hasn't read it to go away and read it now, because it is extremely well written, certainly by HPL standards. It is very short, and it does have a power to it that, while I was a little embarrassed by the degree to which I did find myself identifying with the, well, again, no spoiler. We wouldn't want to spoil something that hasn't been out for less than a century. But I think you're right. I think it does touch something in us. Not necessarily something that we want touched, but it strikes a chord.
It does, and it's a lot of these stories, like I was saying, have their roots branch off into what we see in a lot of the modern sci-fi, modern horror, and even modern fantasy. Because some of the stories of another author that you introduced me to, that I have found I love a lot of his works, Algernon Blackwood. Story The Olive, I think. Even with all of the other good stories that he's told, The Wendigo and whatnot, The Olive is the one that just grabs me because it's so different from the things that you would think of, and it's more along the lines of kind of a fantasy as opposed to something that you would think of as a macabre tale or something that's more gothic horror.
It is. Well, taking that story as an example, it's a good example of that which is, I'm not quite sure who I'm quoting, but evil without being bad. This idea of just the alienage, in that case, the sort of pagan, I suppose one could call it, but the other, the outside influence, intruding in such a benign way, even in a positive way, can be deeply unsettling, nevertheless. And Blackwood is a good example. Blackwood was a very interesting fellow, I think it must be said. I should have liked to have known the man, because I'm not sure if you were aware, I was not until I started digging into his history. This fellow, he started his life as a dairy farmer, and came to writing stories by way of being a New York model, which is, I think, sort of the natural career path for a dairy farmer, but I hadn't known anybody who had done it previously, and a very prolific fellow, very intelligent, and a very fine writer to boot.
Yeah, he was a very good writer. That story, like I said, that is one of my personal favorites. The Wendigo, which is considered one of his classics, is actually a few tiers down for me. And I'm not sure why that is, because it is another one of those really good classic stories, but I get the feeling that he was writing a little bit maybe out of his depth, possibly, that it just, because it doesn't quite mesh as well as some of his other stories.
I can see that, and well, I suppose the Willows. I suppose the touchstone of Blackwooddom is perhaps the Willows. Although actually, there's a story that I'm looking to do on the podcast pretty soon. It's funny. It's funny because it is not necessarily a particularly, I should say, it's a good story, not a particularly challenging one. Which is, I understand it's a strange thing to say, but it's just it's a ghost story. It's called Keeping His Promise, and it, in so many ways, it just follows the formula of the classic sort of ghostly narrative, and yet coming from a lesser writer than Blackwood, one would almost think that it was just a regular ghost story that didn't quite hang together. It just wasn't very good. But knowing that it does come from Blackwood, from this master craftsman, you know that that's not the case. And the more you look at it, the more it kind of comes to pieces and becomes, in its own way, all the stranger for the familiarity of the general narrative. So certainly very different from The Olive, but I would say challenging in a similar way.
Okay, now who are some of your, now that you've been introduced to more of these authors and you've introduced me to more as well, who are some of your favorites in the genre? I know we've talked about the supposed godfather Lovecraft, who I would call him more of an uncle.
The funny uncle, the strange one.
That tells the great stories, but you just kind of want to keep him off to the side most of the time.
It's true. I feel that I like him more. I like him as a concept more probably than as a human being. although, one, not to be ungrateful, who could have written so magnificently about alienage and fear if they hadn't within them something fundamentally a little bit broken and objectionable even? And while one needn't applaud the man or his ideas, I do think that perhaps his own eccentricities bring something to the table that wouldn't have been there otherwise, and that would have been missed if it were gone. As for other authors, well, okay, important plug. Lovecraft's essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, is, I should say, required reading for everybody. If you like stories, if you care about literature, if you care about human psychology, which I do on a purely amateur basis, but in that essay he essentially digests the fiction that had been written to date, obviously, that falls into what he terms weird fiction or cosmic horror. And of that group, there's an author, Robert W. Chambers. Have you read any of the King in Yellow cycle?
I actually just finished. I didn't read it necessarily, but I did download the audiobook version of it and listen to it. So I am familiar with him now.
Fascinating. It's my understanding that he actually did most of his. I believe he wrote romance novels, something potboilers, essentially. Not everything he did was the height of art, but I do appreciate. Well, the Repairer of Reputations is certainly my favorite of his, but he's got a lot of wonderful stuff.
I liked that one, and I cannot think of the name of it right now to save my life from The King in Yellow. I think it was... Yes, it was The Yellow Sign, actually, the one that I fell in love with. And I'm not sure what it was about that story that did it for me. I just can't put my finger on it, but that, I think, to me, was the linchpin for the entire King in Yellow series.
It does so well what I think Lovecraft also did well, and what I think that Deleuze did so poorly. It takes a very deft touch, I think, to really communicate the weird and to maintain the fragile shell of a story, of an idea that is both obscure, that is strange enough to intrigue and to unsettle, without falling so in love with it that you go and ruin it by explaining it and painting it and painting in all the finer details. I think Chambers does a very good job of doing that. And I think that anybody who's familiar with Lovecraft's work would have to look at Chambers, who of course was writing before Lovecraft, and say, aha, here we have so many of the dusty tomes on the shelves of your Professor Armitage and what have you. So many, the Elder Sign finds its family in the works of these prior writers, and in Chambers in particular. I would much rather have seen Lovecraft's estate in the hands of a Chambers, for example, than a Deleuze, but I suppose it probably wouldn't have found quite the popular the popular success in that case. But yes, the Yellow Sign certainly, and even some of the lesser works in The King in Yellow, the Demoiselle D, I should say, is one interesting one, and the whole book. No reason not to read all of them. We have wild enough in time for these particular gems of art.
Yeah, and I will warn the readers that do try to pick up The King in Yellow. Not all of the stories are going to focus on this fictional book. The first 4 stories do in the King in Yellow, and then the second 4 stories fall more into his more of a romantic story. He tells a lot about some kind of a war in Paris, and those 4 stories connect together, and then the King in Yellow stories connect together, and I'm not sure exactly how they were woven together into one book, but there you have it.
And to my mind, there's almost a greater power there, insofar as as it's not heavy-handed. It hides the ball from you. Where your eye wants to go to the yellow side, the king in yellow. What lies within the tattered mantle of the king? That's where we want to look, but he won't show us. We have to follow these other stories, which are good enough stories on their own merits, but they're taking place in this world, in the world of this play that drives men mad. But we never get a story about the play, let alone more insight into the play itself than just occasional snippets. And really, I think that's incredibly powerful. And it's something that I think almost it extends beyond the borders of the man himself, of that particular oeuvre. And it's interesting to see how it laps over elsewhere in fiction. Because, and this is something that I'm actually addressing it's going to be in the next story that I put out for the podcast. But it's a story by Ambrose Bierce. And Bierce, obviously an American writer, very, well, bit of an arsehole, an interesting, a fascinating, a hilarious writer, who also, in his spare time, apparently, wrote some of the most outlandish and innovative horror stories of all time, certainly of his time. Have you read much Bierce?
I have not, actually. That's going to be... I've heard of him. He's kind of like one of those, what Mark Twain would call a classic that everyone tells you should read. No one takes the time to read anymore. But I'm definitely going to have to look into him.
It's a shame. His work's extremely accessible. I really do think that he ought to be required reading, although, of course, then nobody would enjoy him. But essentially, one interesting little. Well, I suppose it's a meme in the proper sense, in the Dawkinsian sense. Just a little bit of a mind virus. Is Hastur, Hastur, and I'd first come across Hastur in Lovecraft, but I then subsequently found mention in Chambers, but apparently, and I've done a little bit of Google scholarship on this, apparently Hastur got his, or its, or whatever the thing is, in Bierce. The first known mention is back in a story called Haita the Shepherd. I don't know what to say about it, apart from that it seems to be sort of a survival, a common thread that wound all the way back from the 1800s, all the way through to today. And, well, here I must throw myself on your mercy. I have not seen, well, I have seen virtually no television at all, but it's a television show called True Detective. Are you familiar?
I'm familiar with it. I haven't watched much of it myself, but I've definitely heard of it.
I only know what I've seen on the internet, on YouTube, etc. But it seems to be, well, as far as I can tell, mostly inspired by Chambers, which is strange. But Hastur is a recurring theme, and so this 6-letter entity, which, I don't know, best created for the sake of a single story and never touched again, has found this new life. And I suppose that gets back to what we were talking about at the start, the way that these stories just, they strike a chord.
The stories do. Now I've got a couple of people that I need to look into. Who are some other authors that you think really define the genre? I mean, I know Poe is in there somewhere. He's kind of the high school required reading as well, though I love Poe. He was my first intro into Gothic horror, and so he's always going to have a special place for me. But who else, along with these giants, who are some of maybe the lesser known ones that you kind of have a fondness for?
Oh, certainly. Well, in Poe, I have made a point of I did a Halloween special on Poe, just popular demand, but I shan't touch him again. He's my unhallowed hand. As far as the more obscure, well, honestly, my original intention with the podcast was to shine a light on some of the lesser known authors, lesser known stories. And one good example of that would be one of the earlier stories that I did. It's called The Man in the Bell, and it is not, I should say, it's certainly not cosmic horror. It's very real. It's about a terrible thing that happens to a man, an absolutely horrifying predicament, which, while it was published in Blackwood's magazine, no relation, but Poe himself was apparently, I'm not sure that I would call him a fan, because he wrote a story essentially making fun of it, but at the same time he had no compunction about stealing it for his own work, which is, of course, the sincerest form of flattery. So make of that what you will. But as I say, that does fall outside the more classically weird realm. In which regard, somebody I'm trying to get into at the moment, he's a modern author, Thomas Ligotti. Are you familiar?
I'm not. I'm going to have to look into him.
I would. He's very strange. I should say, no need to anoint heirs, but insofar as his work is heir to Lovecraft, etc., I should say it's in its untetheredness from convention and from a need for full explanation. The sense that one is occupying the same universe as things which are strange to you, but that this is really a peculiarity of your own. They have always been here. The world has always been like this, and your lack of experience with them is really your good luck to this point, which may or may not hold in the future. So Ligotti is certainly interesting. As far as some of the older, I should like to recommend Dunsany and so on, but to be honest, I don't spend a lot of time reading those older masters of the genre. They're simply, I don't know. I think they show their age a little bit, and are a little more fantastical. Now, you'd mentioned this to a degree a little earlier. Do you read? Do you care for fantasy literature?
Oh, I am a big fan of fantasy literature. I especially like stories in the fantasy realm. I'm getting a lot into the ones that are fantasy but are set in an urban setting. Not so much the romance side of them, but there are a few authors that, for instance, Jim Butcher's The Dresden Files, his first books in there are very good, and he ties in a lot of the, even though it's formulaic, he does tie in a lot of things, like he talks about the outsiders, which sounds very Lovecraftian, and weaves these other mythos into his own, into modern day Chicago.
I have heard of, I have never read, but I shall take the recommendation. Now, I'm a little curious, actually, not to go down a rabbit hole here, but how does magic work in that universe? Because I find that this is a problem that is tackled with greater or lesser success in fantasy novels, and how much I am going to like a work of fantasy largely depends on how well magic is difficult, isn't it? Because if it's fully bound by rules, then it's not magic, it's science by another name. But if it's too unbound by rules, it's just silly. It's a crutch. It's an ex machina. It's a MacGuffin for the driving of the plot. How does that work in the Dresden Files?
In the Dresden Files, it's that the idea of magic. Well, it's like what you were saying, and kind of in a lot of ways the way Lovecraft would describe it. It's he calls it the energy, the life force that certain people are able to craft and use to bend to their will to perform certain acts, and some people are gifted better than others to be able to do that. And so that puts the limitations on it, that it's limited to how powerful or how gifted the practitioner is, but it also has its own rules. Some of them are, for instance, in a lot of fantasy, at least in the good fantasies that I've read, like a lot of the other books by Jim Butcher, or even Mercedes Lackey is another one that I'm a fan of from way back. some of the things that magic can perform as far as actions, it is easier to do them physically than to try to manipulate them magically, like to try to move something across the room or whatever. And so magic is used more when the physical cannot do what needs to be done. And it depends a lot of times, but in a lot of cases it does depend on the ability of the spellcaster, and there are limits that are placed on what magic can do. Like in the Dresden universe, people can be somewhat brought back from the dead. It's frowned upon very, very much so. But in a sense, it can through necromancy, but it's still just a shadow of the person or whatever that you were bringing back. You're not allowed to bring back a person or to perform this kind of magic on a person. You're not allowed to do these certain things, and it's when people break those rules then that the story starts.
Understood. Well, all right. With that, I think an obvious recommendation that I think that I should have for you in that case would be, well, have you read any William Hope Hodgson? I believe I did. Well, I did The Hog.
Yes, The Hog. I've actually been meaning to get into him. He is on my list, because I noticed, at least in the story of The Hog, I saw a lot of parallels to, I cannot think of the character's name, but he is the detective in some of the modern writer. Now his name is escaping me. He wrote some of the movies he's famous for, the Hellraisers.
Barker.
Yes, Clive Barker. His character in Lord of Illusions movie, which is also in some of his books, I saw a lot of Hodgkin's Carnegie character in him.
Interesting. I'm not. I shall have to have a look. I know that Lovecraft in particular did not care for the professional occultist, because of course it does a certain amount of violence to the fundamental conceit of the weird tale if you're going to slice it up and examine it and turn it into a science. Well, it's not weird anymore if it has an explanation, even an occult explanation. It's not properly cosmic horrific anymore, but it's still really good. I must say I do enjoy Hodgson, and the whole Carnegie series is, well, it's enjoyable writing. I mean, just simply as fiction, it's very appealing. And one thing that I particularly appreciate about it is that, well, Carnegie is the ghost finder, but he doesn't always find a ghost. It's sometimes there isn't even any supernatural influence at all in some of his cases, some of these stories, which is a subversion of expectation that honestly helps me a little with the suspension of disbelief, because of course most things aren't supernatural. And so the fact that Carnegie is himself broadly skeptical and takes a coldly rational eye to the fact that suddenly there's an enormous ghostly pighead in his living room, it lends a tone to the proceedings that I have to say I find both approachable and enjoyable.
Yeah, I do like those. I did like that story in particular because it also made me think of some words from Isaac Asimov. I think it was either him or Arthur C. Clarke that said that magic is science that we don't understand.
It is a good quote. I shall butcher it, but I believe it's something along the lines of, what is it? A sufficiently advanced science is indistinguishable from magic. And some internet wag, I don't know who it was, but this is not my line, pointed out that, by extension, any science that is distinguishable from magic is insufficiently advanced. And I think that's something that we can all agree with.
Definitely. Now, do you have any modern authors maybe that you also like to read? Because I know that we're dusting off a lot of the old tomes here, but are there any of the modern writers maybe that you've found also kind of strike that nerve better than some that are out there?
Funny enough, well, I I have something of a, not love-hate, but love-criticize relationship with Neil Gaiman, and most of my internal arguments with Gaiman stem largely from my intense and passionate love of Terry Pratchett. Are you familiar?
Yes, Terry Pratchett is one of my favorites, actually.
Magnificent. A magnificent human being. I suspect that he may not necessarily have been despite I did have the privilege of meeting the man several years ago, but I'm not sure he's real. How any single human could have done so much so perfectly, words fail.
Yeah, I really liked his Discworld series, but another book that I really liked of his was Good Omens. I think that one left me laughing on so many levels.
See, I should have thought Small Gods would have been your favorite.
I'm actually, that one's still on my list. I have not gotten to it yet, but I've definitely read several of the Discworld that I was actually introduced to through a video game back in the late '90s that was voiced by Eric Idle from Monty Python.
Oh yes, I've seen a Discworld, sort of a point and click.
Yes, that was how I got introduced to Terry Pratchett.
Yeah. Oh well, Terry. Incredible, and incredibly funny and witty and insightful and deeply intelligent. I suspect you will enjoy much of what he has to say about religion, which of course on the Discworld, a world that could only have been the creation of not only intelligent design but profoundly unintelligent design. Hilarious, man. Now, as for Good Omens. See, I'm curious. I came to Good Omens I came to it through Pratchett, having already read quite a bit of his work, and having read Pratchett and having read Gaiman, I must say I prefer them separate. Gaiman loved Terry and stole from him at every possible turn, and I don't begrudge him that. I've always viewed Good Omens as a bit of a steak milkshake, if you will. Good ingredients, but I'd rather have them separately.
Well, that is true, and I think that's kind of what I liked about it, was that it was such a mix that it satisfied me on the levels that I needed at the time. But it's one of my favorites in there. I also am a fan of not all of the Hitchhiker's series, but definitely Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, Douglas Adams. That first book was one that just left me floored. I have a profound appreciation for him from that book. The others in the series I was not as happy with, but that first book just grabbed me.
Adams, a magnificent man, and certainly a loss. Now, putting school rivalries aside, he was a Canterburygian, but his loss to the world was incalculable. What he wrote in the short time that we had him was epoch-shattering. I think it's not really fully appreciated how truly magnificent so much of Adams's work was, because it was funny. And I think it's the same thing with Pratchett. We don't appreciate the substance because there is such style. And I suppose it's not really a problem, but it's something that nerds like us can become self-righteous about.
Now, I'm not sure about you, but have you ever read anything by an author? He was popular in the 90s, Piers Anthony. I'm kind of a fan of his Fractal Novel.
Is yes. I have spent a certain amount of my time. Well, as mentioned previously, my mother was when we were speaking earlier, my mother was a marine biologist, and I have spent a certain amount of my life in cramped quarters, not really having a whole lot to do, and very much at the mercy of my little library. And I think I must have gone through the entire Xanth catalog, or at least as much of it as had been written at that point in my life. So yes, Piers Anthony, very, very. It makes me wonder, if I were to go back now, I wonder if I would still like it. Certainly it was a tremendous influence on me at the time. I don't know, do you read Anthony's stuff still? Is it actually good?
I've not touched it since then. I know that he introduced me, among other things, to my love of puns, the Xanth series, but when I was in middle school, I tried to read another series that he did. It was the Mode series, but I am not someone that's inclined to mathematics, and the Mode series, like Fractal Mode and such, it started getting into physics in the same way that one of the Xanth books actually broke down the demon that basically gave the land of Xanth its power was in the middle of this giant chess tournament, and his name was actually this scientific formula. This algorithm
is the true name, the true name of the demon being something. Yes, I do recall. My familiarity with Anthony's other work, well, the flyleaf of the paperback, also by this author. That's the extent of my knowledge of the non-Xanth Anthony's. Never read any of them.
Now, what do you think of some of the ones that are, I hate to call them tropes of the genre, but people like Stephen King and Clive Barker?
To be bluntly honest, I haven't read a lot of... I've read some of King's short stories, and I tend to find myself getting angry at them, because he's... Honestly, my big beef with Stephen King is that, well, I do appreciate, for example, H.P. Lovecraft to perhaps not to depth, but with great passion. And King's tendency to borrow piecemeal... I mean, there's stealing and there's stealing. And some of his short stories are just lifted so directly from Poe and Lovecraft, etc. And what I honestly find most galling about it is he didn't even take the good stuff. He's got a short story, and I think it's called Graveyard Shift. He's got a book called that, and that might have been the name of the story. Anyhow, it's The Rats in the Walls, which is one of my favorite Lovecraft stories. But at the same time, it's not. It's as if he essentially takes everything that is incidental about the story. There are rats, there are monsters deep down underground, and we have those. And he even calls the queen rat, his queen rat, he calls her the Magna Mater, entirely absent any of the discussion of the Cybele cult or any of the attendant scholarship that is what really makes the story, The Rats in the Walls, so good. And so I have my own beef with King. I know he's an incredible talent and a treasure of the genre, etc. I have my quibbles with him, but I'm not willing to be led. Do you have any particular recommendations?
With Stephen King, it's hard for me. He's one of those authors that I love him for his descriptive style, that he is very good at setting the scene. I mean, he will sit there and spend 7-8 paragraphs describing the brick of the house that you're about to go into. He's very descriptive, but at the same time, I kind of like you. I feel like a lot of his stories are simply a rehash. I'm thinking right off the bat, if you've ever seen a movie that was some of his short stories called Creepshow 2.
I haven't.
The very first story is him, this country farmer in New England, that a meteorite lands on his property, and you start to see where this is going. It's pulled straight out of Lovecraft. I mean, just the color from outer space.
Color out of space, absolutely.
It is. It's that story, and on the one hand, I'm happy because it's keeping that idea alive, but at the same time, like you said, you can, if you're someone that's a fan of the genre, you can see where he's just stolen these ideas and not even done them well.
And that's really the insult. I mean, we all know there's nothing new under the sun. When Omer smote his bloomin' lyre, stories he'd heard by land and sea, and what he thought he might require, he went and took the same as me. There's nothing wrong with that. Lovecraft did it. Everybody does it. I think the lack of discrimination it shows, that to take something that is wonderful, and it's it's cutting a masterpiece out of the frame and then keeping the frame. It's upsetting.
Now, Clive Barker is one that I think his early work, some of his later stuff got to be a little bit formulaic and droll, but some of his earlier works, like The Hellbound Heart, which later became Hellraiser, Cabal was another one of my favorites, which became Nightbreed. His early stuff, you could see the Lovecraftian influences and other, as I'm getting into the genre more, I can see other influences that also bred to it. But he puts his own twist to it, and it just takes you and grabs you. Those are two stories that I definitely recommend. If you're going to read Lovecraft, do not touch Imagica. That is junk. But Cabal is a very good story. The movie version of it, I believe, was called The Nightbreed, but the book is much better. The Hellbound Heart, which later became Hellraiser, is another story that very Lovecraftian, especially in the sense that, like Lovecraft, liked to take his supernatural horror, but it was outside. While it was supernatural, at the same time, it wasn't a divinity kind of thing. It was just, it was just part of what happens.
Certainly.
And so Barker is, in his early work, was also very good at crafting that, but at the same time making it his own and not outright stealing from these other sources.
I should certainly like to know Barker better. I know very little. I know of some of his work, but that, and I fear that I'm not necessarily giving him the best audition. Just generally aware of Pinhead, etc. Volumes 1 through 17.
Yeah, once it got the first Hellraiser movie, I thought it was good, and then I went and read The Hellbound Heart, and the movie pales in comparison. I mean, even though Barker had a direct hand in everything that was done, it was still that short story is still so much better.
And I shall have to.
One that I definitely recommend.
I shall have to dig in, and it's funny. Trying to not that one can read what one likes. It's interesting plotting the boundaries between what is properly weird fiction and what is more typically genre, I suppose. What I know of Hellraiser is pretty formulaic. Of course, I could also be completely wrong. My impression is that it's demons, demons in the classic sense. And there's nothing wrong with that. Same as with ghosts in the classic sense. I'm a strong proponent of M.R. James, whose work, while I should say it strays occasionally to the boundaries of the weird, is largely just good stories, good ghost stories, and I'm fine with that.
Yeah, I did read. I was very. I love the M.R. James story that you've read on your own podcast, and I went and looked into some others of his. Some of his stuff was just very. It was formulaic to a sense, but there was one story in particular which I cannot think of the name of it, but it was something to do with a whistle.
Oh, whistle and I'll come to you, my lad.
That one, yes. It was apparently the reason that it is so famous is because in the 60s, BBC did a production of it that later became a tradition, a Christmas tradition, that they will go ahead and do an adaptation of an M.R. James story around Christmas time. But when I read the story itself, I had to laugh at certain parts because the ghost that he describes in the story, it literally is someone with, a sheet over nothing that's got, because it describes the face being just wrinkled linen, and that was what I thought of, was the bedsheet ghost that you see on Halloween.
It is. Well, see, and that's the thing. It's the beautiful subversion of the and of course we don't know, and I'd say that story is probably a pretty good example of where James does stray a little more towards the weird, in that we don't know. We never find out what exactly this entity is that has been summoned and that does indeed turn up. But yes, it is the sheet ghost, and yet I will confess, it's an uncomfortable story for me to read late at night if I expect to be sleeping anytime soon. I do find it. I find a certain chilling power there. More so, I should say, than a lot of even of James's stories. So, for example, the one that I did for the podcast was Casting the Runes, which is a fantastic story. It's one of the most enjoyable stories to read, but I wouldn't say it's scary. I wouldn't say it's hard to. It doesn't really get inside you.
Now, your most recent episode, I'm gonna probably jump ahead a little bit, but you did the Caterpillars, E.F. Benson. Yeah. Are there any other stories by him that you would recommend?
Benson, he's an interesting fellow with a very interesting family. As far as his stories are concerned, well, he certainly wrote a lot of them. I don't know. Caterpillars is the favorite. I'm less generally familiar with his work. I'd say I've probably read a dozen of his stories, but I'll confess, I think that he is essentially, I should put him on the same sort of tier as a craftsman as James. I'm not sure that I wouldn't choose Benson over James for the most part. Just being bluntly honest, not that his stuff isn't good. It is. It's extremely good, but I don't know. It doesn't stick to the brain quite the same way.
That's true. So just because we're starting to run up towards the end of time here on this, but so what do you have in store for the future with One Last Story? I mean, I know there's hopefully going to be a lot more coming from you. Do you have any previews of what's coming up in the future?
Oh, well, as I said, I've cleaning up a recording of an Ambrose Bierce story at the moment, and I am looking at Blackwood. I'm not sure. I'm always taking suggestions. Certainly, I think I'm considering the Olive. There are a couple of Blackwood stories that I'm looking at, and of course, well, Lovecraft is the big crowd pleaser. Everybody loves Lovecraft, and everybody comes and listens to Lovecraft. And so, if I need a spike in listenership, that's a surefire way to do it. But that said, honestly, I should like to start reading longer things. And this is a question that I'd have for you. Some of the work that I've done spans multiple episodes, and I think that can work very well. But I'm not sure that it's necessarily what the people want. What's your experience? What would you suggest?
I think, I hate to sound wishy-washy, but a little bit of both, because I've enjoyed both the short stories that you've read, and also I've been on the edge of my seat with the nail biters, stopping myself from sending you a message saying, when's the next part coming out? Come on, you're killing me. So I would say just keep what you're doing with the mix. You seem to have found the perfect balance there, where you'll tell some good short stories that are one episode, and then you'll throw in one that spans 2 or 3 episodes that are just nail biters.
Excellent. Well, my attention deficit disorder, as crippling as it is in most regards, I'm happy that it has a positive. It has borne some positive fruit here. And one experiment that I believe I tried it once, possibly not more than once, was multiple very short stories in a single. I believe I did de Maupassant, who is another magnificent author, obviously, and Saki. In the same, have you read much Saki?
I have not, actually.
I cannot recommend it. Fantastic, witty, literate, just an amazing author. And the fact that little of his work is falls into the horror genre or the weird genre, honestly just makes it better. Most of his stuff is just incredibly funny. Some of his horror fiction is incredibly funny.
Okay,
the story of his that I've done was called Sredni Vashtar, and it is a masterwork. It is incomparable. I did it no justice, and I strongly recommend that you read it for yourself, and everyone read it for themselves.
That story gave me nightmares. I'm sorry. That was what you give yourself. You don't give yourself enough credit. I think that Sredni Vashtar was probably one of the ones that I like the most. Just being transported into that boy's world and what he was doing, and then of course the ending to it just kept me on the edge of my seat through the whole story. I think it's one of my favorites that you've read so far.
Then there may need to be more Saki in the future. He's H.H. Munro Saki, an exceptional author, a much overlooked author, I should say, who wrote an extraordinary number of wonderful, very short little stories. And so, I don't know, I may need to deviate from the proper theme of the podcast and just do a little Saki. I've already done it once for the Toad After Supper, the Christmas ghost stories.
Yes, that one. I actually found myself kind of chuckling with that one. I really like those as well. I hate to sound like a fanboy, but there's not an episode I think that you've put out yet that I have not enjoyed.
Well, I hope that your experience is not unique, and I shall certainly strive to hopefully only improve the quality. We here at One Last Story Incorporated, our number one goal is to serve you.
Well, now, how can folks find your podcast, and how can they contact you? Maybe if they have some story suggestions, or they maybe want to get some suggestions of who maybe to look at within the genre.
I would strongly suggest that they go to www.therealadrianward.com. You can find me on iTunes as well, and I suggest that you do so. By all means, any wonderful things that you want to say about the podcast would be more than appreciated, and tell your friends. It's a treasure that I am nakedly stealing from the annals of history. These are wonderful stories. I enjoy them. Obviously, they are there to be enjoyed. Read them, and come to my podcast and listen to them as well. Every second Sunday, there should be a new episode. And so, yes, by all means, drop me a line. You can go either through the website or at therealadrianward@gmail.com. And yes, please keep listening.
Yes, folks, I really do highly recommend Adrian Ward's podcast. It is some excellent reading, and as someone who is an amateur voice actor on the side myself, he does an excellent job reading all of these stories. I highly recommend his podcast. As a matter of fact, just go ahead and stop the show now and go listen. But I want to thank you again, Adrian, for coming on. It's been a real pleasure talking to you.
Brother Brewer, the pleasure has been mine entirely, I can assure you.
All right. Well, we're going to go ahead and end the recording here. So I'm going to go ahead and close off here. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Before we close this evening, I want to give a shout out to the folks at Secular Yakking for having me on their show to talk a little bit about the brew pub and a few other things that came up during the conversation. It was a blast. There was a little bit of a snafu with scheduling. So that episode, I think, is supposed to drop this week, and I will be sharing a link on Facebook and on my website as soon as the episode drops. I also want to thank the show's patrons, the members of the Order of St. Hitchens, or the Oh Shit. If you want to help support the show, you can go to patreon.com/Skeptics Brewpub and make a per-episode donation to also become a member of the Order of St. Hitchens. Or you can give me a 5-star review on iTunes or Stitcher to help broaden our reach. You can send any fan mail, hate mail, or other messages to me at brotherbrewer.skepticsbrewpub.com. And if you have a bozo that you'd like to nominate for Bozo of the Week, you can drop me a line at the Facebook page or send it to weeklybozo@skepticsbrewpub.com. And also over at facebook.com/beer and blasphemy, you can find updates about what's coming up on the show, as well as on skepticsbrewpub.com. At skepticsbrewpub.com, you'll also find the Bozo archives, links to other great secular podcasts, some podcasts on self-care, and some other great links. Next week on the show, I'm going to have the atheist mega band Monster on Sunday to come into the pub and talk about their music, their activism, and whatever else just happens to come up that evening. We'll also unveil a new Bozo of the Week, so be sure to tune in next Monday, 8:30 p.m. Central on skepticsbrewpub.com. Good night, everybody. Remember, believe nothing that you hear, half of what you see, and never have a serious conversation without a 2-drink minimum. Good night, everybody.
To Anacreon in heaven, where he sat in full glee, a few sons of harmony sent a petition that he their inspirer and patron would be. When this answer arrived from the jolly old Grecian, voice, fiddle, and flute no longer be mute. I'll lend you my name and inspire you to boot, and besides I'll instruct you like me to entwine the myrtle of Venus with Bacchus's vine. And besides I'll instruct you like me to entwine